So our next speaker is Dr. Shelley Hoover. Shelley is a research scientist with Alberta Agriculture and Rural Development in Lethbridge. Her research focuses on plant-pollinator environment interactions, pollination, bee health, breeding, and behavior. Originally from Alberta, Shelley received her BSc from the University of Northern British Columbia and a PhD from Simon Fraser University. She then left BC and went to Christchurch, where she was an NSERC postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Canterbury. Following that, she returned to Canada and was a research associate with the University of British Columbia Centre for High Throughput Biology and Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada Beaver Lodge Research Farm before taking her current position with Alberta Agriculture. So please help me welcome Shelley Hoover.
Thanks, Autumn, and I want to thank you all for braving the roads this morning to make it here. I'll try and show you lots of pretty pictures about bees to make it worth your while. So you may or may not know, but there's actually more than one bee industry in Canada. When people talk about bees, usually this is what they think of. This is the European honeybee, Apis mellifera, and as the name implies, this species was brought over from Europe primarily for honey production. So this is the bee that most people think of when they think of bees. And this is what they typically look like when they're kept in a production setting. We have these large wooden boxes filled with 8 to 10 movable combs. And to make the colony larger, you just stack another box on top. So they're kept primarily for honey production and also for pollination. So this is the typical honeybee that most people think of. But we also have other bee industries in Canada. We have this bee here. This is a native species of bumblebee. So these are the big, hairy tanks of the bee world. These are the ones that are active first in the day. They're bigger, so it's easier for them to stay warm. So they can actually fly at colder temperatures than our other bees. But these are also kept commercially. This is what a commercial bumblebee colony looks like. It's sort of a cardboard file box. And inside of this box is a plastic cage, essentially. But the bees can come and go from these holes. And these types of bee boxes are used primarily in the greenhouse production industry for tomatoes and peppers, but also for blueberries in the field. And this is what a bumblebee colony looks like on the inside. You can see it's sort of a jumble of these wax pots. The lighter colored ones actually had developing bee brood inside, and then the darker ones are used to store their food, so the nectar and the pollen that they've collected from the field. You see this bee here, this huge one, this is the queen. So like a honeybee, bumblebees are a social species. So that means that they have a queen, and the queen is the one primarily doing the reproduction, and the workers are doing the bulk of the work. They go out and they forage and they rear the brood. But we also have another bee industry in Canada. This is an alfalfa leafcutter bee. This guy here is sticking out his tongue at us. They're used primarily for alfalfa and canola pollination. And they nest in these little holes here that are provided by leafcutter bee producers. And these are not a social species. So each female actually reproduces, and each female mates and lays her own eggs. This is what they look like in a pollination setting. You can see there's these tents out in this alfalfa field and this canola field. So they're used for alfalfa and hybrid seed production for canola. And inside of these tents or shelters are wooden or styrofoam blocks. And inside these blocks, they've got holes drilled into them. And so the females will go in and they'll construct a cocoon and lay an egg on top of a ball of pollen and mixed provisions. And each of these holes contains a series of these eggs. You see this female here has collected a piece of petal to make one of these cocoons to put her egg in. And I should add the leafcutter bee is a bee, but it's about as related to a honey or a bumblebee as a giraffe is to a goat. So there's a lot of similarities between these two animals, but there's also a lot of physiological and behavioral and ecological differences between these two groups, the social bees and the leafcutter bees. But it's not all about these managed bees. There's a huge diversity of pollinators out there in our agroecosystems. This is just a few of the ones that I found on thistle alone. So you can see we have beetles pollinating this thistle. We have some native bumblebees. This is actually a fly, which is a bee mimicking fly. But they're also good pollinators of canola, actually. We have honeybees, we have a moth, we have a butterfly and a bee on the same flower. We have birds, we have solitary bees and other butterflies. So you can see there's a huge number of animals out there that are actually doing this free service of pollinating our crops for us. So why is this important? This is hugely important, I would argue, because animal pollinators, and primarily this is bees, increase the output of 75% of all of the crops globally. That's huge. And look at her. All these yellow dots, this is pollen. She's got pollen on her eyes. That's brilliant. So I'm not an alarmist. I'm not here to tell you that, as populations of pollinators are declining, we're all going to starve to death. There's a number of staple foods that don't require animal pollinators. Things like rice, oats, potatoes, corn, all the seafood, of course, doesn't require pollination being in the ocean. So there's a lot of these staple crops that we depend on that don't require animal pollinators. But compare that to this. These are the foods that require pollinators to increase their yield or are entirely dependent on pollinators. So things like our oilseed crops, sunflower, canola. Obviously, you don't need a bee to grow a carrot, but you do need a bee to produce the seed to grow the carrot, and same for onions. A lot of crops that we all love. We could live without coffee, but do we really want to? Also, chocolate. Almonds are a very important crop for bees. In the US, over 75% of all of the honeybee colonies in the entire nation are trucked into California for almond pollination. So almonds are actually what drives the beekeeping industry in the United States. Fruits, obviously hugely dependent on pollinators, not only for yield, but also for the quality and the appearance of the fruit, so the value of the crop. Crops you wouldn't think of, like cotton, and also forage crops that help produce the meat and the dairy products that we like to eat. So these are crops that ultimately supply a lot of the calories and proteins and fat that we use in our diet. But they're also incredibly important for nutritional reasons. They produce they help the yield of crops that produce vitamin A, C, and E. These are all animal pollinated crops. And a large proportion of the minerals in our diet, particularly for people in poorer nations who don't eat a lot of meat, these come from crops that are pollinated by bees. If you look, particularly in the equatorial regions, especially in Africa, there's a significant proportion of the population that is undernourished. They aren't getting the vitamins and minerals that they need. And if pollinators decline and the yields of these important nutritional crops decline, people can't afford to eat them, and they start relying on these staples like rice. There have actually been isolated incidents. There's isolated regions where they simply do not have enough pollinators to produce a crop. You can see in this county in China, they're actually pollinating apples by hand. So I don't know if you can imagine this, but imagine all the acreages of canola on the prairies. Imagine if we had to pollinate that by hand. How many people would be able to afford to do that? So in Canada, bees are primarily used for the production of fruit and hybrid canola seed. They also contribute to the commodity canola crop, the yield. So honeybees are primarily used for canola, for blueberries, for apples, and of course for honey production. The leafcutter bees are used obviously for alfalfa, but also for hybrid canola seed production. And bumblebees are used for blueberries and also in greenhouses for tomatoes and peppers primarily. As with other agriculture industries, what we're seeing in the honeybee industry is consolidation. You can see up until the Second World War, the number of beekeepers and bee colonies is tracking fairly well. We see this sharp increase right here because of rationing, sugar rationing in World War II. So a lot of people took up beekeeping. It was really encouraged as a way to get your sweets when you couldn't have sugar. And then after the war, it dropped off. But then what we see here is that it diverges. So the number of beekeepers is this red line. So that's pretty low. We're at about 7,000 beekeepers, honey beekeepers nationally, and about 700,000 colonies. So the size of each operation is growing. This drop here, this is attributable to the import of a new parasitic mite that came in the late 80s, and also the closure of our border. So we were no longer allowed to bring in cheap imports of American bees. And this rise here is actually attributable to hybrid canola seed production. So there's been increased demand in Alberta for honeybees to pollinate canola. And I should add that in Alberta, we actually have about 40% of all of the honeybees in the nation in Alberta. So you're saying to yourself, wait a minute, I thought bee populations were in trouble. I thought we were all worried about the bees. So if we're getting an increase in the number of honeybee colonies in Canada, what's the trouble? Well, the trouble is this, our winter loss. We have more bee colonies, but we also have more colonies dying. The economic threshold the beekeepers tell us for profitability is about 15% of colonies dying over the winter, so 15% winter loss. And you can see this dotted blue line. This is the average Alberta winter loss over the last few years. And you can see we're always in the red. We're always above that. So what beekeepers do when they lose a bunch of colonies is either they buy them, they can import them from New Zealand or Australia, or they split their own colonies. So you can't split a cow and make 2 cows, but you can split a honeybee colony and make several new honeybee colonies. But when you do that, it's smaller, and so it produces less honey. So they're increasing their colony numbers to keep up with this, but it's not sustainable in the long run, economically, for the operations. There's a Polish poet who said, no snowflake in the avalanche ever feels responsible for that avalanche. And that's what we're seeing with bee death. There's a huge number of contributing factors, but no one factor that we can pinpoint and say, this is what's driving it. And of course, as we've all learned in the last 24 hours, our literal snowflake, winter, can be a real force of nature to be reckoned with. And this is true for honeybee winter loss as well. If we have a long, extended winter or cold winter, we see higher levels of mortality. And that's what happened in Manitoba this year. They had about 46% winter loss because of the long, extended winter. They couldn't get in and feed their colonies. The bees couldn't get out and forage. There's nothing to forage on anyway. And imagine you're a bee, and you've held it all winter long. You really need to go and get out and fly and defecate. So this has detrimental health effects on the bees. But also we have nutrition. So what are the bees eating? Are they eating a diversity of floral sources? The genetics of the queen. We import a huge number of queens from places like New Zealand, Australia, South America. And are these bees really the best bees for our environment? Pesticides and fungicides play a huge role too. They're encountering all of these different agrochemicals in the environment, and I'll speak a bit more about that in a minute. There's a large number of diseases and parasites that impact bee health, but also beekeeping management. And of course, I mentioned weather. So if you're a bee, this is public enemy number 1, Varroa destructor. It's a mite, and it also transmits viruses to the bees. So imagine this mite, which if it was on you would be about saucer-sized. So imagine you have 2 or 3 of these saucer-sized mites sucking your blood, and you bend over and tuck your kid into bed, and these mites drop off you and they suck onto your kid, and they're sucking your kid's blood and transmitting the flu. Imagine how you would feel. So these mites have hugely detrimental effects on the bees, and it's a race. We have all these chemical treatments, but the mites develop resistance, so we're in a race to keep up with treatments for these mites. This is Nosema apis and serranis, so we have 2 species of this microsporidian parasite. It's a single-celled fungus that affects their digestive system. So essentially it wrecks their digestive system and they can't absorb any nutrients anymore. We also have American foul brood. This is a bacteria that basically putrefies the brood. So this would have been a larva. And so if they get a bad infection of this, they can't properly develop brood. And what happens is that the colony actually collapses and it starts to die. But then other bee colonies will come and they'll rob out the stores from this colony and bring that infection back into their own colony. So the disease can spread that way. It can also spread by beekeepers moving combs between colonies. Agrochemicals can have a diversity of effects on bees depending on the chemical and on the route of exposure. There can be acute effects with immediate bee death, or chronic effects where bees have impaired immune function, so they're less resistant to these other parasites and pathogens. It can impair the reproduction, or you can even lose the queen. Agrochemicals are also used to change the habitat. So herbicides can reduce the roadside vegetation or reduce the amount of vegetation available when crops aren't in bloom. They can also impair the bees' navigation or foraging ability out in the field. They just simply don't return. So we like to think of bees as this great filter. So they go out in the environment and somehow magically they come back with this pure pollen or pure honey. But that is simply not the case. These bees here, this is a picture taken in France, they were busy foraging at the M&M factory. So you can see what they brought back. I used to have bees out at the coal docks out in Tsawwassen in BC, and they brought back coal because it's the right particle size. So they were packing coal into their comb and trying to feed that to their brood. And this is the crop that the beekeeper got off. And this is a real problem for this beekeeper because legally this isn't honey. It doesn't come from a plant source, and you can see clearly it doesn't meet the color requirements for honey. So this poor beekeeper can't even sell the crop that his bees are bringing back. So the bees go out and they encounter all these agrochemicals in the environment. There's insecticides, there's herbicides, there's fungicides, there's all the adjuvants associated with a particular product. And there's also acaricides. So these are things that the beekeepers themselves are treating the bees with. And so all these things get brought back by the bees into the colony, and they persist in the colony environment. Wax is a lipid, and so a lot of these things are actually quite soluble in beeswax, and they can persist in the beeswax for decades. So we don't have good data from Canada, but in the US, they detected over 118 pesticides or their metabolites from samples of pollen and wax taken from honeybee colonies. They found 98 different chemicals in the pollen destined to feed the developing bee brood. And 91% of the pollen samples had more than 3 agrochemicals. The average number of agrochemicals they detected was 7 in a single pollen sample. And only less than 1% of the wax samples had no detectable pesticides. And this is what the bees are rearing their brood in. So if we look at the most commonly detected agrochemicals, if we just look at the top 10, you can see that 3 of them in red are acaricides. So fluvalinate, coumaphos, amitraz, these are things that the honey beekeepers put in their bee colonies to treat the mites. But we also see a number of different things. We see fungicides. That's not that surprising if you think about it, because you're allowed to spray fungicides on crops that are in bloom. We also see herbicides and insecticides. But the interesting thing was that there was no neonicotinoid residues found on the bees, although there were some detections obtained from samples of pollen and wax. And neonicotinoids have been a huge issue in the media recently over the last about 2 years. They've received a lot of press, especially in Europe, but also in North America. So you're thinking, what? A lot of people can't even say neonicotinoid. It's hard to wrap your tongue around. It's a class of insecticides that irreversibly binds to receptors in the insect's central nervous system. So this is the part of your nervous system that tells your body what to do. It incorporates all the information it's getting from your body, and it organizes it, and it helps you coordinate the efforts of all the different parts of the insect's body. So low levels of these compounds cause excitations of the nerves irreversibly. And so higher levels result in paralysis or even death of the insect, which is sort of the point, right? So neonicotinoids actually block a specific pathway, and this pathway is more abundant in insects than it is in birds and mammals. And so that's why it's a good insecticide, because it's more toxic to insects than it is to us or the other animals in the environment. So that's why people like to use it. Neonicotinoids are systemic, which means that they're absorbed and transported to all parts of the plant. They're incorporated in the stems, the flowers, and also the nectar and the pollen and the leaves. Just like I'm sure many of you have seen this type of flower in a flower shop. Well, they stick it in dye, and it sucks up the dye, and it becomes incorporated in the petals. This is the similar theory to what's happening with these neonicotinoids. And they're so prevalent now that imidacloprid, which is a neonicotinoid, is actually the most widespread insecticide used. There's a huge number of different products and trade names these are marketed under, and a lot of different compounds that fall into this class. But I'm sure all of you have used some of these. Gaucho, Cruiser, Poncho, there's a large number of products that are neonicotinoids. Now what's happening in Europe is that beekeepers in France and Germany have experienced high bee losses. This is common to basically the whole northern hemisphere. But they've associated these high bee mortalities with neonicotinoid insecticides. So the European Union has suspended the use of 3, imidacloprid, clothianidin, and thiamexetham, on crops that are attractive to bees. And they've put a 2-year moratorium, actually started 2 days ago, to see if there's any effects of this ban on bee health. A lot of scientists argue that this is not a long enough band to even detect these effects because they do persist in the environment. So we'll see 2 years from now what happens with that, I guess. Lab studies have confirmed that these insecticides are toxic to bees. That's kind of not a surprise. It's an insecticide. It should be toxic to insects. But they've also found that these effects include impaired learning and memory at low doses. So bees can go out to the field, but they forget where they are or they can't find their way home. Field studies have also found low levels of imidacloprid in a high percentage of pollen samples collected from a number of crops, including maize, sunflower, and canola. In Canada, what we've seen is that neonicotinoid presence has been associated with bee deaths in Quebec, Ontario, and Manitoba. And the PMRA, which is in Health Canada, found this was associated with the exposure to contaminated dust during the planting of treated corn seeds. So this is specifically in Canada associated with corn planting. So they issued a statement that current agricultural practices relating to the use of neonicotinoid, corn and soybean seed are not sustainable. And they issued a notice of intent outlining action to protect bees from exposure to these pesticides. So this includes additional protective measures for corn and soy production, like different lubricants in the seeders, planters, and different packaging. They've also expedited the reevaluation of all the uses of neonicotinoid insecticides, and they want updated value information to support the continued use as a seed dressing, and also label improvements for the pesticide and seed packaging. But this being Alberta, we're interested in canola, of course. And neonicotinoids, like I mentioned, have been detected in the pollen and nectar of canola, but there's been no evidence of increased mortality of bees during the planting of canola or associated with bees foraging on seed-treated canola to date. But of course, there's other agrochemicals out there besides neonicotinoids. There's fungicides. There's no label law preventing the spray of fungicides on blooming crop. And what happens is that foraging bees, they go out to the field and they get pollen and they bring it back to their hive or their nest. And this is the primary protein source used for the developing bees. They mix it with nectar and enzymes and fungi and bacterial organisms to create this bee bread or pollen ball, whatever it's called for the particular bee. And it increases the nutritional value over just straight pollen. And we really don't know what effect these fungicides have alone or in conjunction with all these other agrochemicals that are out there. Fungicides, we do know, can increase the toxicity of insecticides and acaricides that bees are exposed to, and they can also affect the bee's ability to detoxify these harmful compounds. So you may have a fungicide and a miticide, and maybe just the miticide alone doesn't hurt the bees, but in combination with the fungicide, they can't detoxify both compounds. And we also know that bees exposed to fungicides are more vulnerable to this microsporidium fungus, Nosema, that has detrimental health effects on honeybees. And they also have suppressed immunity to viruses. So there's a number of different ways that bees can be exposed to these chemicals. The most obvious, of course, is direct application. So the bees are simply sprayed with it. There's also drift of insecticide onto blooming crops or onto weeds that are adjacent to the treated fields. Insecticidal dust can be collected with the pollen and brought back. One of the most common routes is actually drinking contaminated water. So these compounds get into the water, into the puddles, or there's a container left out, and the bees will go and forage on that. Because bees actually forage for water too, not just nectar and pollen. Or of course through contaminated nectar and pollen. What can farmers do to try and help this? Well, they can communicate. Beekeepers should be in contact with the landowners and vice versa. Know where your bees are. Know where your neighbors have bees. Use mechanical or cultural control of the weeds where you can, or use a pre-bloom control. Don't apply agrochemicals to crops in bloom or crops with weed in bloom if you can avoid it, or spray when the bees aren't present, or warn beekeepers prior to application. Who can tell where the bees are in this picture? Anybody? So if you're a sprayer, you may not know there's bees sitting right here unless someone tells you. So ground application typically has left drift than aerial application, but it's also easier for the applicator to see what's going on in environment areas to avoid. Apply insecticides late in the evening or early morning. Evening applications are actually less hazardous to bees, but please try to spray everything, including fungicides, when bees aren't actually on the field. Use insecticides with a lower toxicity to bees if you have an option. And also, apparently emulsifiable formulations have a shorter residual toxicity. You can also visit the Alberta Agriculture webpage for more information on how to reduce bee poisonings, or just Google reduce bee poisoning. Oregon State actually has a how to reduce bee poisoning manual that's just come out this year. It's really good. Some of the information is more applicable to the US situation, but a lot of the general practices are still very much applicable to our environment. Also, grow flowers if you have the chance. It seems very simple, but bees need forage year-round. They need a diversity of different crops to feed on. No animal likes to eat only one thing. So, plant crops that provide bee forage. Fruit trees are great. Berries, mustards, squashes, buckwheat, clover, alfalfa, sandpoint. There's a huge number of crops that flower that bees love. Don't spray your weeds unnecessarily if you can avoid it. Even things like dandelions are a very important early season crop for bees. Many weed species do provide valuable forage for pollinators when these crops aren't in bloom. And it's not just the managed pollinators, it's not just the leafcutter bees and the honeybees, the things you're paying to have on your crops. It's all the pollinators in the environment. And plant bee-friendly plants. So in your gardens, in your field margins, in your hedgerows, try and provide year-round forage and habitat for these bees. And I can answer any questions. I think I have time. Thank you very much.